What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Find Your True Fire podcast. And today I have a very special guest, Mr. T. I love, to have you here. I'm used to calling you Mr. T, so get used to it. But we have a very special guest here, my former teacher, Mrs. Texeira. How you doing? How's everything?
I am well. And then for those who are listening, I did tell him that he could call me Sam. I know that that's probably strange for former students. I'm doing well. I've been on summer break, doing some traveling, working, teacher trainings, working out, cleaning my house. So it's been really nice to be able to transition in a break and just really finally get a sense of relaxation.
That's awesome. Super excited, like I said. So just for people's sake, because some people are watching that might know you. Also, some people who are guests don't know who you are. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and also what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a high school teacher. Really proud of that. I have been for well over a decade now. I was CJ's teacher. 9th and 10th grade, or 9th and 11th. I can't remember. I think I had you twice.
9th, 10th, and 11th.
Yeah. So I teach high school. When I was in Boston, I also facilitated a group called Strong Men, Strong Leaders, which was an elective at the Henderson School where I worked, which was dedicated to supports for men of color, young men of color. In addition to my teaching responsibilities, I'm also a PhD student at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, and I am a national faculty member with PBL Works, where I train teachers in different parts of the country on project-based learning.
That's awesome. It's cool to see that you're doing a lot, even in Chicago now too. I think because there's a lot of you're like a hero. Like you do a lot of things for the community, for schools, and I still have that Strong Man hoodie. It's in my room. I should have wore it. I don't know why I didn't.
You know what? You're right. It's so funny because I was just telling you that I was doing a lot of cleaning, and I have a really small apartment. It's like one bedroom. So I have to be real creative with my closet space. So I have like bins, but I rotate out like in the summer, I rotate my clothes from the bins to the closets. And then I do the same thing when it gets cold again. And when I was doing that, I found my Strong Men, Strong Leaders hoodie. And it brought back so many memories. I mean, I have like several of those hoodies, but yeah, it brought back so many memories. And I have to say, I appreciate you calling me a hero, but I don't feel like that. And what I mean by that is that, I appreciate the comment, but I feel like I was just one guy doing something that I felt like could bring motivation to students, could bring interest, but I didn't make Strong Men on my own. I know that you weren't there that very first year that we started it. This was in 2015. So I think you probably still would have been in middle school. But it was, a group of myself and several young men who graduated mostly in 2018, a handful in 2019 and 2017. And I just sort of said, you know what, here's the supports that our school would like to have for young men of color. And I was really particular about saying, this is not going to be where you put all the bad kids. It's not going to be where you put all the kids with A's. We're going to get a really good, diverse mix of young men. And we're going to build this from the ground up. And so it was, in as much as I was the facilitator during that time period, it would not have happened without students like you all, without the dedication of students. I still talk about Strong Men. I don't know if I showed you, I probably did, but I have a Strong Men tattoo. It was probably the most meaningful work I've done in my teaching career. And what mattered to me was how much it mattered to you all. Even things like the trial process for admission, like the fact that you all picked who got to be in, not me. Like Mondays tutoring and supporting each other. I really miss those days. And it's something that even as I'm involved here in Chicago, one of the things that happens when you're a teacher, or at least I should say that's happened for me, is as you get older in this field, you think about like, okay, I'm a better teacher now in that I'm more experienced. But I also can't imagine that I could do a Strong Men, Strong Leaders now here in this context. Sometimes a lot of things that happen are about time and place and luck and fortune. And so that mattered a lot to me because, like I said earlier, when I moved to Chicago, like working with youth, mentoring, teaching, it's all one and the same, being involved in the community. But there will never be another Strong Men, Strong Leaders. Like, even when I show my students here in Chicago, they'll say things like, oh, well, can we do that here? And it's not doable, not in the same way. I mean, there's things that are great that I do with young people, but Strong Men, Strong Leaders was really, it was really remarkable. And I miss that as a teacher. But I also know that life is different now. The kind of teacher I am is different. The context where I teach is much different. And so there were several things that I think made Strong Men, Strong Leaders really work well. One of them was that we had a small school. And because we had a small school and because we had an innovation school, it was a lot easier to just have an idea and to just be able to do things. The school I just left, 1,200 kids. My next school, 2,400 kids. And so it would be much harder to get something like that off of the ground here. Even, and I credit this Lamperon for really allowing me to take this vision and to take you all along the vision with me and say, you know what, even though we don't have a template for this, we're just going to do it. And it's going to work. In a big established school like the one I work at now, that's just a lot harder to do because there's already sort of norms and traditions and that kind of thing. But because Henderson was a relatively new high school, we were able to, I think, be really innovative and creative. And so I'm really grateful that it ended up working out that way. And like I said, to this day, I maintain, like, when people say, what's the most important thing you've ever done as a teacher? And by far, it's Strong Men, Strong Leaders.
That's awesome to hear that. I think because, I remember you did show us the tattoo of Strong Men, Strong Leaders and how much it meant. And I think that is a good point you make. It's like a collaborative effort in a way. Like you were facilitating it, allowed us to grow and support you in it. And we created something special. I do truly agree. And I think we all in a way carry the message of Strong Men, Strong Leaders, because it was a group, but it was like we carry like principles and just different things. It's almost like a way of life. But yeah, that's good stuff. It's amazing just to hear kind of the backstory behind Strong Men, just hearing the mindset behind it. Just we're gonna build this from the ground up. And I think we did that. I think we did just that. It feels good to be part of community and part of people that have the same like vision in a way. And
one of the things that was the hardest for me about leaving Boston was that I felt like I didn't get a chance to say a proper goodbye. And I wanted to do something in Strong Men, Strong Leaders. And of course, the pandemic hit. And I remember, I know you graduated in 2021. So you remember I guess it would have been your junior year. We had that like, okay, it's going to be 2 weeks. Okay, it's going to be a month. Okay, we might come back. Like they kept telling us and like stringing it along.
That was crazy.
And I just felt like I never got an opportunity to properly close it out. And that's something that, unfortunately, the pandemic took a lot from people. It took families. It took graduations, proms, birthdays. And, thank God I didn't lose anybody. And, I always say that I'm glad that what was I when the pandemic started? I was like 30, going on 31. I'm glad to have experienced it at 30 instead of at, like in high school where you miss out a lot. But the one big thing I do feel like I missed out on was the ability to say a proper goodbye, both to like students in general at the Henderson, but in particular for Strong Men, Strong Leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that. And because like that can probably, like, especially for you, that could create a sense of like, dang, like a, not regret, but just like, dang, like I wish I, had it. But
it felt like it didn't end properly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. The proper end. I understand that. I think through it all, I mean, we're all ultimately happy for you, even with your new opportunity, because happy that you got a new opportunity in Chicago and got to do new things. And I feel like I still follow up with the community there. I feel like we kind of live like strong men, strong leaders.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that's really at the core. Like you said, it's a mindset, it's a lifestyle, and I don't think that I think it's narrow enough where we can be guided by values and that I think are really important. But I think it's broad enough that anybody can sort of fit into it, and I think that was really, really important about making Strong Men, Strong Leaders a space for everybody. You are very different than Canby, who's very different than Nick, who's very different than Andrew, who's very different than Melvin. And I think that there's something really beautiful about the mix of strong men, strong leaders.
100%. Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's dope. I think just the aspects of strong leaders, there's a lot of sense of like core values and beliefs that help make the program and make the what we do. But I was gonna ask you, like, how have those values and beliefs kind of shaped your identity and like how you look at life?
So when you sent me the questions earlier today, I really thought about this, and it's hard to being a teacher is a part of my identity. It's a really central part of my identity, in the same way that like being a Black man is a part of my identity. And like, and so one of my defaults is to always go into like teacher mode, even in other avenues of life. So I tried to think about how would I answer this question about core values, both who I am as a teacher, but also outside of that. So right now, this ugly background, I'm in the boardroom of the building I live in. I'm the HOA president, homeowner association. Okay. And so I'm the president of it, and we have this boardroom, and there's a lot of drama in the HOA, to be honest. And I think anybody that knows about how HOAs function, the easiest way to explain it is I own a home, but it's in a building. And so everybody owns their apartment, but we also own common units or common areas. And so if you own a regular house, when your roof breaks, you have to fix it, and that's it. Well, if there's an issue with the roof here, we all have to put in. Or if there's an issue, and so when you own, when there's common ownership, that causes a lot of drama. And I'll be frank, there's like crazy people in the HOA. Well, a crazy person, but I say all that to say, like, people take this very seriously because it deals with their money. And so even in this role, I'm like, okay, what is a role, like, given this, which is very different than being a teacher, but like given the role I have as president of the HOA, and given like my teacher role, and given my role even facilitating trainings for teachers, which is some of the work I do over the summer. And if I had to say like core values, the two that I think really, really guide me, are to stand up for other people who need a voice, who need an ally, who need an advocate, and honesty. And when I say honesty, I mean like just keeping it real with people. I think that that's really, really important. I think most of us really want that to our core. There's a lot of life, especially like professionally or just being an adult, that's just a bunch of BS. It's a bunch of like, you have to do things to check the box, not because they're actually important, but just because it is what it is. And I feel like people like to know that. Even now, I told you I left my school, my last school. I'm coming to a new school. And so the kids are writing me cards. And one of the things they always says, I appreciate you for always being real with us. I think people want that. I'm always a person who wants that. Even if something doesn't sound good, just give it to me straight. And of course you want to do that with tact, but that is a really important value to me. And so, because you'd asked another question about like a time that my core values have conflicted with issue or like other issues or things like that, or I guess I would say have been in conflict. And I know I'm kind of jumping ahead, but
no, you're good.
The reason I thought really deeply about this question, because I feel like, people ask, what are your core values? And people just make stuff up and they just say things like, oh, my core values are this and that. But I was like, no, let me really, really think about this. So I came up with those two. And one of the things that I think is true when you try to keep it real with people, and you try to be honest with people, but also when, as a person like me, I try to also like lead my life in a way that, respects people, that is true to my core beliefs about social justice and like helping out the underdog and things like that, being an advocate for people, thinking about like people who've advocated for me in spaces I've been in. That has been in conflict professionally sometimes. So I was thinking about this story, funny enough. So do you know what city year is?
Yeah.
So for those who are, I guess this is so funny to say this, for those who are listening to the podcast or watching the podcast, before I was a teacher, so I've officially been teaching since 2014. But a couple of years before that, I worked in schools. So my first job in a school, I was in a middle school, and I was a city year. And this is an AmeriCorps volunteer program. They are really, really big, especially in Boston. They are in Chicago, but they're not as like notable as they are here or there. Excuse me. You notice them more. So I say that because I knew that I had wanted to be a teacher. I knew I had wanted to work in Boston public schools. And one of the things that's true probably in most industries, but certainly in education, is everybody knows everybody. Everybody's constantly talking. And I think that when you are one of few Black men, and I'll just be honest, one of few anything, right? I mean, I can only speak from my experience, but I'm sure it's one of few anything. You're always cognizant of like, okay, anything I do is going to always be under the microscope. Anything I do is going to be watched differently. And, you know, I know like looking at me right now, it might be hard to imagine, but at the time I didn't have a beard. I had a full head of hair, or maybe it wasn't full, but it was a head of hair. So I looked much younger. Wow. And it was very clear that I was young at the time. And so there was a teacher who she had purchased this kid a lock for his locker, like a combination lock. The kid had been in and out of foster care, had a really tough life, phenomenal young man. And one of my colleagues told me about an issue that was going on where this teacher would say things like, and I'm not going to say the young man's name, but let's just imagine it was John. She would say like, John, why do you keep acting up in class? Remember I brought you that lock? John, why do you keep doing that? I bought you that. And she did that multiple times to a point where like John was pissed, and he came to me and he told me about it. And I remember talking to a mentor of mine about it, the teacher whose classroom I worked in, who became a really important mentor in my life. And he said to me, well, Sam, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, now that you've heard this, like, you have a responsibility to say something. And intimidated because I was like, well, shit, like, what if, you know, like, what if this creates bad blood? Or what if this, you know, like, I'm just a city year, I'm not a real teacher. What if this messes with my potential career? I'm trying to get my foot in the door. But honestly, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to say something. What's the worst that can happen? Like, it might be awkward for a little bit. And, you know, of course, like, I know how to do it in a way, or I thought I knew how to do it in a way that was tactful, but that also kind of like told her, like, you need to be checked on this. This is wrong, what you're doing. And so, you know, she and I had the conversation, and it was good. But honestly, I distinctly remember that space because it was my very first year working in schools, being like, you know what? I am going to stand up for what I think is right. Even if other people don't agree, even if it's awkward, because when he said to me, if you don't do it, who will? That always stuck with me. That's something I remember to this day, 12 years later. And that's been important for me. And so that's like the first example, but there are plenty other examples I can think of where I've spoken, particularly like principals, which is why, like, when I mentioned Ms. Lampron, I really appreciate her. I think people want to be respected. I could always have a conversation with her, you know, respectfully, but say, hey, you know what? This is what I actually think. I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm going to be very honest with you. But also, you don't have to worry about me, like, you know, excuse my language, but like talking shit behind your back or stirring the pot or getting engaged in like the foolishness and the silliness that can happen in any job. And so I think that for me, that's been really important because there are going to be times that I say things that people don't like, that I do things people don't like. That's true as HOA president. That's true as a teacher. That's true in front of a room full of teachers as a facilitator. But I think that as long as people know where you're coming from, as long as people at least understand that at your core, you're doing this for what you believe are the right reasons, and that you're doing it with transparency, then things usually end up the right way. And when they don't, it's kind of like, well, you know what? I stand by what I said. I stand by what I did. This is well thought out for me. You know, and part of my journey of being a man is just taking a stand. And so I can think of plenty of instances, even where I've kind of gotten in trouble, where I'm like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't have said this, but everybody in the room is thinking this, and we're just going to put this out there and have a real conversation about this because we can't ignore elephants in the rooms. So that's how I try to be. And, you know, I know people who are like, I don't have a filter. I just say what I think. And that's stupid to me. We all have a filter. We all have to like think about how we're going to be received by others. But, you know, I do think about how I'm received by others, but I also think as long as I'm being guided by doing what's right and doing what's right in the interest of not just me, but people in general, then usually most of the time I come out on top. And so that I would say that keeping it real and thinking about the underdog and speaking up on behalf of others are probably the two things that have really guided me the most.
Yeah. And it's crazy when you say that, you can see it. It's like literally when you think of Miss Texeira, that is exactly.
Yeah, that's funny.
It's like, wow, that's perfectly described. I
don't even think I always had words to put those two together. But like I said, every time my kids would write letters, they would always say like, Mr. T, thanks for keeping it real. And I was like, yeah, I guess that is important to me. And, even when I go talk to other people, like I think there was a conversation I had with my principal recently about this crazy girl in my class. I mean, she was crazy. And I just had to close the door and be like, look, Mr. So-and-so, I just need you to keep it real with me. Like, what is going? This girl was like cussing people out left and right, cussing teachers out, cussing students out, like walking around the hall doing whatever she wanted. And you know me, that's just not going to happen.
That's not good
at all, at all. No. And so I told her like, you need to step outside. I'm not going anywhere. What do you mean you're not going? This is ridiculous. So it just got to a point where like, should I have done the back and forth with her? Probably not. But at a certain point, it's like, wait a minute. This is a student that like every single person is like, oh, that's how she is. That's how she is. No, I don't know. I don't accept that. Like, this is crazy. I'm not doing anything wrong. Like, this girl is cussing people out. And like, there has to be a stop. But even in that, like talking to the principal, he was kind of like, look, this is what I can do. That my hands are tied, blah, blah, blah. And even though like I didn't like the response, I appreciated him for being honest with me. Because that's all you can ask for. Like I can't make him do anything. He can't make me do anything. But if we're just honest about things, and then I was honest with him, you know what? Okay, fine. If you're telling me that I just have to tolerate the foolishness, and if this girl fails with a 59.4, don't ask me to bump her up. And that might sound mean or whatever, but it was just like, no, we need to be very honest about like what we're doing here. Right. And I just think that people deserve that. And I think it's really one of the reasons why I really like teaching high school because I couldn't work with little kids. Like, I don't know what to do when kids cry. And like, I couldn't imagine like having the same 30 kids in the room all day. But I think that when you work with high school, one of the things that's great about it, and I can say this having taught all 4 years, is you get to really see people go from like fresh out of middle school to like adult men and women. Yeah. You get to stay in contact with them in a way that feels more meaningful. Like I'm sure you can if you teach elementary, but it's not the same because there's a gap versus like I knew for years and years and years. And now you're 21 now.
Yeah. 21.
Yeah. Now I know, like, I know you at 21. So I can imagine like where you were in 9th grade and it's not that much. I mean, it's different, obviously, like you're a man and you've grown, but it's not the same as if I were to know you at like age 5 and then meet you at 21. But I really appreciate the ability to just keep it real with high school kids. And I also think about my own life and what I would have needed at that age. And I would have needed the honesty. I would have needed like, hey, this is what adulthood really is. My parents didn't go to college. Even the ways that life was just structured for adults. So if my dad were still alive, he'd be 61. My mom is 56. So they came up in the 80s and 90s. And so life was just a very different thing for them. And so I can't imagine, or I should say adulthood was very different. In their minds, oh, you went to college, you should automatically be making big money. And it's like, no, that's not how this works. But they didn't have the ability to explain that to me in ways that I needed to understand. So what's really important for me is preparing young people for adulthood. Because it sneaks on you and it's really like really fast. My first experience being a homeowner, I just bought my condo a few years ago. Everything is new to me. Like every single thing is new to me. And so even that, like I try to spend a lot of time talking to kids about what is it like to be a first-time homeowner? What is it like to run up a massive bunch of credit card debt and like really have to figure out, okay, how do I pay this off? What is it like to like have student loan debt and massive amounts of student loan debt that I'll probably never be able to pay off? And, even like having that conversation with kids, maybe you should really think about some life decisions now before you make them, because I just think that making life decisions at 17 or 18 is, you don't really know who you are. Like, when I think about who I was at 25, 30, I didn't fully know who I was. And so I think that by being a high school teacher, I can really live out those values of keeping it real with people and also fighting for the underdog. And it means it means something different than it would if I were like working with younger kids, where I would have to filter myself, watch my language, and that things that just don't come naturally to me as a person.
But no, that was like, I think like you were saying, like these core values are literally you. I think a lot of the reason why a lot of the youth, including myself, respect you is because you keep it real. Even with the things that we don't want to hear, they push us to be better. Like, looking back at it now, obviously.
Wait, I have a question actually for you, and I know you're asking the questions.
Okay.
But, maybe it's easier to. Did I ever piss you off as a teacher? I feel like there's of course there's times where, you piss off everybody, and I don't remember like I can think of certain times with certain students where I'm like, oh, I know that I pissed this kid off, and then we made up and we moved on.
Yeah.
Did I ever do anything to piss you off or make you angry or like?
That's a great question, actually. Not like, I mean, because I'm not someone that's easily angered. I think there's this one day I was having a bad day, and then I was just like kind of moving. I was just not moving up to speed, and then you like called me out. I was like, whoa, no, he didn't just embarrass me in front of everybody. But
well, I'm sorry about that. I apologize. No, I'm serious. You know what? Like, and I'm not even being facetious. One of the things as I've gotten older in teaching, because you grow as a teacher.
Yeah,
I am who I am. I mean, that hasn't gone away, right? Clearly, that's who I am as a teacher. But there are definitely times where I'm like, oh, maybe I could have done that differently, or maybe I should have done X, Y, and Z differently. Not for you specifically, but like there have been kids who've said, "Hey, Mr. T, you did X, Y, Z that day that pissed me off." I don't even remember that I did that, to be honest. Like, it wasn't personal for me. It wasn't. And so, I apologize for calling you out years later publicly. I shouldn't have done that. And it is something that I'm trying to work on, is like, how do I continue to show up to be my better self? Now, that doesn't mean put up with BS, but I also know who you were. You're not a BS type kid. Or you're not a kid, you're a man. This is crazy. You're 21.
It's wild.
You are not a BS type of kid. But yeah, I know I could be very I have the tendency to be a little bit hard-lined. So yeah, I apologize.
But it's always, and I appreciate that. It's cool to see, like how you can still continue to grow as we get older.
Yeah.
But no, like I reflect on that moment. It's just like, there's moments like that maybe in that moment I honestly needed, like, just to like, pick up the pace, just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Because you were just like, your honesty and your willingness to speak up for us was very evident in the way that you wanted us to have fair rights that maybe older students had, or hey, I don't know why do these kids not have this? And you were very honest and upfront. You didn't hide anything back, and that's why we can trust you so much in the position you had, and I think teachers as well.
I appreciate you saying that. And one of the conversations I had very early on was when we were making Strong Men, Strong Leaders, was that anytime, were you there when we went to that jail?
Yeah.
Okay, so do you remember the people in the jail who thought that we were that you all were like on Scared Straight?
Yeah.
I share that because I think that anytime people see like a group of boys, particularly boys of color, particularly Black boys, there's just an assumption that like, oh, these kids need guidance or they're in trouble. And it's like, no, like that's not what this is. We're building an authentic community. This is not about me being a parent or like whipping kids into shape. Like, we actually had a whole unit about like prison recidivism, as you remember, school to prison pipeline. And I was very conscious of that kind of thinking implicitly, because it's usually implicit. It's not usually something that people say. Like, I remember I used to like do things with Strongman. People would come up to me, particularly a lot of white folks, and be like, oh, I love what you're doing for these boys. I'm like, you don't even know what I'm doing. You just see like an adult man with a group of Black boys and you just have assumptions. But I wanted to make sure that we were both offering supports for you all, but again, supports that you all came up with. Like, I had a vision for what I wanted: athleticism, combating negative narratives about men of color, academic support, discussing what was going on in our lives and communities. But ultimately, I felt like beyond that, who am I to say like what support any person needs? Because this is not strictly an athletic program. This is not strictly an academic program. This is not strictly a social emotional. It's everything. And I think everybody gets out of Strong Men what they need. And so I think because of that, and because of the perception of how we often, and when I say we, I'm talking about the general, we see Black boys in school, boys of color in school, and think about like, oh, they're in trouble or they need to be whipped into shape or that kind of thing. It was important for me not to like do anything that fell into that narrative or that created that illusion. And so that was one of the reasons why I also felt like it was really important for me to speak up, like about like, hey, we need this, we need field trips, we need this, we need that. If you all want us to have the program, because Strongmen certainly made the school look good, but I didn't do it to make the school look good. I didn't do it to make me look good. But that's just that was the byproduct.
Cause and effect.
Right. Then like we need to be armed with like the support to be able to do this. So like the field trips, the sweaters, things like that. Like that was really important for me to be able to speak up for, because you can't do things like that without resources. And so again, I'm going to come back to her, but I really appreciate Ms. Lamperon for always like supporting us as far as that goes. But also even other things outside of strong men, strong leaders. I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember when they were locking the bathrooms for a little bit? Because there were like issues of fights. And I remember that.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah. And I remember telling like Eliana, like, go speak to Miss Lamperon. Go say like, this is BS. This is unfair. You all are locking all the bathrooms in the school or in the high school floor because 2 or 3 kids got into a fight, but you're not dealing with these 2 or 3 kids. That's not right. And so what I found is that when you speak up on behalf of like kids or anybody, very often like I would say something and then other people around me, and I'm talking about teachers, would say like, then they would speak up. And very often they would say things like, well, I don't want to be the first, Sam, you should, because like, you're on so-and-so's good side. And I don't mind that. Like, I don't mind being that person. Sometimes it can be frustrating. Like, why do I have to be the one to do it? But incidences like that gave me pause to remember that, again, this is not just me saying like, hey, Sam, I think this. We're all talking about this. We all see the need. So like somebody's got to be the one to say something.
100%. Yeah. No, I think speaking up on behalf like that's super important, because like I like the quote you said, like if I don't do it, who will? Just having that type of initiative is like it's needed, and especially the school that we were in, like there's not much people like that. Like or not saying there's just
I'll be very honest with you. There are times where I've been disappointed with myself in my career. Not even just like before I heard that if you don't, who will, that I didn't speak up, that I felt like, you know what, I should have. But, so it's not like I'm not sitting here professing this to be like I'm some perfect person that always does it. There are also just political realities. And sometimes you can't say exactly what you need to say. And then other times it's like, you know what, I can say this and it won't make a difference. So let me hold off. So I think that we all make value judgments. But I think that at my core, I try as best I can.
100%. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I wanted to ask, like, what advice would you give to someone that's like struggling to like hold on to their core values and like use them in their life, if that makes sense?
I think the most important thing. So I started therapy recently. Not recently. It's been almost 2 years. But one of the things that I am learning in therapy, and for a very long time, it was like taboo for me. Like, oh, I'm not going to do therapy. That's for people who are crazy and all that. And it's sort of like unlearning the negative stereotypes that we have in our minds, particularly as Black people, about mental health and that sort of thing. But one of the things that my therapist has challenged me to consider is that people change over time. If you're in a relationship with somebody, that person that you're in a relationship with today may not be the same person. I mean, they're the same person, but like things about them will change 5 years from now, for example. And so thinking about that, I would say our core values can change, and it's okay to still figure out what those core values are. Like even when you ask me at 35 years old and somebody who's constantly thinking about values and myself and what do I believe in, I had to really sit and think today about like, okay, what are my core values? If I had to outline, like I said, I was thinking, okay, no more than 3 things. And I only was able to come up with 2. So what I think is that it's really important for people to be honest with themselves about who they are at the moment, what they need, to be honest with themselves that things can change, your core values can change, and to give yourself grace in that space. What I would say is that as long as you are acting morally, you're probably always doing you're probably always on the better side of things if you're conducting yourself with morals. And of course, that's subjective. What I think is moral, somebody else may not. But, if you had asked me the question about my core values at 25, my answer probably wouldn't have been that good. I would have given you something, but it would have been made up. So what I would say to people is like, really try and think about who am I in this moment? What direction am I going in? And really like, why do I need core values? When I thought about the two I gave you, like there's a guiding reason why like keeping it real and fighting for the underdog or advocating for others is important to me. I think about the times that I needed advocacy, people to advocate for me. I think about the times that I needed people to be honest with me. And I think about those two things being central in pretty much all things I do. I think that your core values can change, and I think that your core values can often be situational. And so what I would say to people is like, take the time to figure out what those things really are to you. Because even as life changes, I think once you figure out what those values are, what your core values are, what sort of guides you, life will change. I'm not very different. I keep saying that. I am who I am in my life is different now than it was 5 years ago, which is different than 5 years ago than it was 10 years ago. But I think that what guides me is not that much different. And so if you would ask me this question at age 40 and not 35, maybe my answer would be different. But I would say the most important thing is to really think about like why it is that you want to even identify values. What is this for? I think that what's really unfortunate is when people don't think that they have any core values. They are sort of just, and it doesn't mean that they're fixed. They can change, but when people just sort of go along to get along, when people are self-serving, I think that's really unfortunate. And I don't say that with judgment. I think that we're all on a journey. Maybe I think that for some people, it's entirely narcissistic. Like I'm just looking out for me. I don't care about anybody else. I think that for some people, they're just sort of figuring out who they are. So I think that if I were talking to somebody your age, somebody in their early 20s, your 20s were a really important period of my life of transition and of figuring out like what kind of adulthood I wanted to cultivate. At 21, I knew certain things about myself that are still true today at 35, but I also know that there's so much about my life that I couldn't have even imagined at age 21. So what I tell people, there's a really good YouTube video. It's a TED Talk, and it's about why your 20s are so important. And when I spoke at the 2019 graduation, I remember the message I gave the students being that your 20s, like 18, 19, 20, 21, they're not. It was like a few days before I turned 30 in 2019, and I remember this is why this was the theme. But I had essentially said like your 20s are not a layover for adulthood; they are the foundation for the adulthood that you want to build. Not the perfect foundation, but something. And so what I would say to people who are in their 20s is think about your core values in terms of what kind of adult do you want to be at 35, 45, 55, knowing that can change, but how do you want to start to build that now? And I think that that's an extension of what I said about teaching high school. When you teach high school, you think, okay, how do I help kids transition into adulthood? And then it's not like, like I've mentioned this before, and I've probably mentioned iterations of this to your classes, but it's not like, a light switch where you turn 18 and like, that's it. Like, how you can dim lights sometimes, like they can go all the way bright or dimmer.
Yeah.
I feel like that's how adulthood is. Like 18 is one step, and then renting your first apartment might be another step. And then getting your first serious relationship and your first serious breakup and your first car, like whatever. Like there's steps and steps and steps to adulthood. And so what I would say is like your 20s should be about figuring out what your core values are, to think about the kind of adult that you want to be, the kind of life you want to live.
That's so true. I think because I guess like the way the journey is like laid out is like you said, it's like 18. Oh, I'm grown now. Like, but there's a lot of maturity that comes into like 18 to 19 and then 19, 20. That kind of like, I like that light analogy, like of lights just sparking up and sometimes even getting more dim as times happen. You know, it's not like just this constant growth ladder where you go from 18 to 21 and you grow, but sometimes growth is going back to go forward and like,
yes, absolutely. Well said.
So yeah, that's good stuff. I'm holding on to that for sure. I was gonna ask you, like, also, like, do you have any like pivotal moments that influence your personal growth? I hear you like say like you're getting into like therapy now, and different things. But has there been anything in life where it kind of led you to new experiences and new interests?
Yeah, I think things. I think that with that question, there's, there's what do they say, like peaks and valleys or mountains and valleys, whatever it is. Like there's highs and lows,
Yeah.
and so I think that there are seminal moments in my life that really influenced who I am, how I think about things. The things that like stand out for me, like if I were writing a book of my life and just thought about like a select few chapters, one of them was going to the high school I went to, so like ninth grade. And I say that because K through 8, the schools I went to were all Black, and I don't mean like 90% Black, 95, like literally there was nobody in my class who was not Black. From kindergarten to 8th grade, working class suburb of Atlanta. And then I moved in high school where I was one of very few Black people. And that was a very different experience for me. And learning to navigate a much different world was very different. And one of the things that is true is like, of course, from kindergarten to 8th grade, I knew I was Black. And I understood race in America to the extent that somebody can in the 8th grade. But when everybody in the room is Black, then in a way, it's like you see people as individuals for who they are. Right. But when you are one of the few Black people in the room, the first thing you are is Black. And you understand that. And everybody in the school was rich. Not everybody, but most people in the school were very rich. My family was not. So learning to navigate that and learning to like sort of really be an outsider. And of course, race is only one way to be an outsider. There were ways in which like in a room full of Black people, I was an outsider there too. But it's very different when like you physically look different, you stand out with the racial content, especially then. That was over 20 years ago. So that moment really stood out and I think shaped me, and not as a moment, but like thinking about, okay, how am I navigating your teenage years when everything is transitioning and changing? How do I stay true to who I am as a person, as a man, but also like navigate what it means to be in this space? So that was one of them. The other was the death of my dad. I talked about quite a bit. He took his own life. We had a really complex relationship. And I think that, when suicide happens in any family, it really, for me anyway, compromised a lot in our family. It opened up a lot of doors, I think. It forced me to contend with a lot of stuff that was deep in there and probably still is. I have a really complicated relationship with my family then and since, but, improving. And then I think about going to grad school because I was a political science major in college. And I did really well in my political science classes, but, I had to take core classes in math and science, and I did terrible in those. Like I passed, but not really well. And so I never thought that I would have been able to even go to grad school and to get a master's degree. And so earning that was really, really, really huge in my life. So yeah, and then you know what? And then of course I would say the other one was moving to Chicago, and I say that because I had a life in Boston that I really liked. I was really happy there. I don't know if I ever told you this, but so in 2019 I won Teacher of the Year.
Yeah,
like with several other teachers, and the following year, and I had been in like the Henderson as a documentary. There was some like local news thing. I just like every 5 minutes there was always like cameras in our classroom, and so I mentioned that because during the pandemic, so I knew by October 2019. It's actually a really funny story. Actually, I don't know if you remember this, but in the fall of 2019, so you would have been the beginning of your junior year.
Yeah,
it was a really crazy storm in October. And this tree fell and it hit my car.
I remember that.
Yeah. Remember that? Yeah. So I was like, well, I'm not going to buy a car immediately. I live really close to the school. I'll just take Uber and I'll save money. And then when I figured I was going to Chicago, I was like, I really am not going to buy a car now. I'm just going to use this to like all the money I was spending on my car note, on my insurance. I had paid off the car, but at that point on gas, I'm just going to save this money for my move. So when I first went to Chicago on a conference, I was like, I really love this city, and it's more affordable than Boston. I could become a homeowner in a way that I probably could never have if I still lived in Boston, at least not in the city. So it was a huge decision to think about moving, but I was like, I really like this. And at the time I was 30, I was like, I can't, if I need to do this now because I'm not going to move at like 35, 40. This is like the last time I can really do something like this.
Yeah.
Fast forward, the pandemic hit. At this point, I had already had a job lined up in Chicago, but once the pandemic hit, it was like, okay, do I really want to move at this time? But I was actually the president of the Boston Teachers Union called me and asked if I would consider running for office for city council for District 4, which was the seat that at the time Andrea Campbell held. And I actually really thought through it, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to go through with this. This is a lifelong ambition of mine. I'd always wanted to run for office, and had established OCPF is the Office of Campaign and Finance in Massachusetts. I'd established that I was running, that kind of thing, which is public information. And of course, it's during the pandemic, so nobody knew what was going on. The election would have been in November. Well, September would have been the preliminary, and then November of 21, so the following year. But, when you run for office, you have to raise a lot of money and talk to a lot of people. And I was like, I think I can possibly reasonably do this. But there was a point where I was like, you know what? I want to do this. It's something I've really thought about for a long time. I'd already spoken to people. But at the end of the day, I really didn't want to give up the opportunity to move to Chicago, which was this really unique opportunity I had then. And, I was kind of like, okay, do I do this? Do I follow through with this campaign for city council, or do I pursue this dream moving to Chicago? So obviously I picked Chicago. And when I did, I said, okay, there's a few things I'm going to have to do. One is I'm going to have to get back into grad school because I was doing a doctoral program there. I just did the 1 year. So I was like, okay, I'm going to switch here. And then 2, I'm going to get my fitness under control. So I work out much more regularly now. I lost a bunch of weight. And then the third thing was that I wanted to become a homeowner. And I was like, I can't just move to Chicago randomly, just be like, okay, cool, I just moved at 30 and my life is the exact same. That wouldn't make sense. If life is about growth, it can't just be that I just like the city of Chicago and I want to live here. There should be some practical opportunities that make sense for me to make this move. And so that was really important in my life because I think that it was one of the bigger risks I've taken. And I'm actually not a person who likes to take risks. I like to play things safe. I like to always think about every opportunity and every option. Yeah. What if this? What if that? But even in taking that risk, I was like, okay, there's just some things I have to be certain about. I don't even remember the question, but just in terms of thinking about kind of really important chapters of my life, really important moments. Like I said, going to high school, the death of my father, finishing my master's degree, and definitely moving to Chicago.
Yeah. And I mean, you kind of answered the question with your story. It's just how those moments shaping you to grow as a man. And it's cool. And I appreciate you sharing a lot of that stuff. And I think it's really inspiring to see how you overcame those things and how they even influence your decision to move to Chicago and take that risk.
Thank you.
Which you can probably thank yourself later for it too, which is it's amazing. I think it's cool for us as listeners and viewers to see how sometimes life hits hard, but how we respond to it is super important because with responses, it could either put us in a growth in a situation to grow, or we can kind of regress or even slow down, So
yeah, I think so too. I think even thinking about how you just said about responses, my dad's death, he committed suicide August 1st of 2012. And I had to show up in Boston literally days later. And I remember people being like, wait, days? What? And I was like, no, I swear. But I think that for me, one of the reasons I became the kind of teacher I guess I'd say I am, but I especially was when I was in Boston, is because I just jumped right into work because it was a distraction for me. It was really helpful for me to sort of dive into the work head on, do every single thing, volunteer on this and be on this committee and do this and do that and sign up for that. Even before I worked with the Henderson, I was like that. And I think that was my coping mechanism, which was helpful for me.
Yeah.
But I also feel like in some ways it was also it's also important for us to give ourselves space. We don't have to do all of the work. And I think that is something I still struggle with because I am naturally a person who likes to be involved. But sometimes like, well, maybe I'm over involved. Maybe I should take a step back. And I think that probably that'll be something I struggle with until the day I die. But I know that for me, that was my response was, jumping in headfirst into work and not having time to sit around and feel sad, not having time to deal with family issues. I don't even think that was necessarily the most healthy way. But at that point in my life, I was not a person who was in a space to go to therapy. But I definitely feel like I learned a lot about myself then. And I think that now at 35, it would be so much different if this happened, recently in my life. But that was definitely my response. And I think that that's probably in large part why I became the kind of teacher I did in Boston.
Mm. Yeah, no, thanks for also sharing that part of your story because it helps us to kind of understand. And it's super. I think it's a great thing you got therapy, like just to see kind of the parts that you maybe not be able to see, And
yeah,
that was part really of growth, like you said. It's like you get to see who you are in a full sense.
You know what? I'm a huge Kendrick Lamar fan, and when he released his most recent album in 2022, he had talked about therapy, and it sounds corny, but honestly, like him talking about therapy in the Big Steppers album was really instrumental in me being like, okay, you know what? I'm going to actually do this. Like if Kendrick Lamar can like rap about therapy and talk about his experience and that kind of thing, like who am I to be like, I can't do this. So honestly, I'm just really glad we're at the moment we are in the world where it's no longer taboo, where people, are fine with doing it and they, it's not embarrassing and that kind of thing. I wish that I had the ability to do that early in life when I had a lot of trauma early on as a young person. But also it's cool. Like, I'm here now and life works out the way it should. But I always tell people that they should do it if they can. And I also have an amazing therapist. His name is Ken. It was really important for me to find a therapist who was a Black man. I wanted somebody who had, in some ways, some shared experiences. And again, some ways, because we're not all the same. But also, initially, I wanted a guy who was much older than me because I was like, oh, if I get somebody who's older than me, they'll have all this wisdom. And my brother was like, no, you should go with somebody. You should try to find somebody closer in age to you because they'll more or less understand the world that you live in. And it was really helpful. I don't know how old Ken is. I mean, he's around my age, maybe a little bit younger. But that has been really, really, really helpful. So I think that, one of the things that I've discovered in therapy is, let me walk back. One of the things that I've when I first started going, I was paying out of pocket. Now my insurance is covering it. But, when you pay out of pocket, and therapy is not cheap. You're like, I want to get the most out of this that I can. And so I need to be able to be like 100% honest with this person. But in order for you to be 100% honest, like you can't just do that with anybody. You have to feel out like, okay, how can I? So like I said, I needed certain metrics in the beginning. I wanted a Black man. Eventually I came to want somebody younger. But, I also know friends of mine who, they've tried things out and they've like, this doesn't really work for me. I'm going to go to somebody else. And so I say, I encourage people who want to do it. Even if you're just going through some stuff, even if it's temporary. Like initially, the reason why I did therapy was not because like I needed to unpack a whole lot of stuff. I didn't even plan on doing it for 2 years. There was one specific thing that was going on in my life. And I was like, I just need to talk about this specific thing with somebody. And, it opened up to something much, much, much different. So yeah, huge advocate. And I would be remiss to not mention that in this podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love how you shout out your peoples too. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because one thing that you mentioned was just like, you had to make sure that, with that advice, you had to make sure that your counselor for therapy was like, relatively in age, like kind of so you can live in your world and also, of your race of Black. And I want to ask, like, what do you recommend? What strategies do you recommend for people that are trying to find new opportunities, but they want to align it with their values, if that makes sense?
When you say new opportunities and align with their values, do you mean professionally, personally, or otherwise?
Yeah, just in life, honestly. Like, what's your thought process with seeking out new opportunities with things that like align with what you value?
Remember I told you earlier, I don't feel like I'm much of a risk taker, but I think that it's important that we all lean into discomfort. And when I say we, I'm talking about those of us who are not big risk takers, that we lean into discomfort sometimes and we be willing to actually take a step out there and do something much different. So what I would say is if somebody is charting a new path, that they should always have a backup plan. So, for example, like when I mentioned moving to Chicago, I didn't just move here on a whim. I saved up money for like from October 2019 to July of 2020 when I moved here. I was strategic about like, this is the neighborhood I want to live in. I did my research. I looked at like cost of living and things like that. So I think the biggest thing I would say to people is take risks, but take calculated risks. Don't just do things willy-nilly. I spoke to Mr. Renrick. He's lived in Chicago, and like I remember talking to him. Shout out to Mr. Renrick, really outstanding mentor for me. But yeah, like I would tell people to take risks that are calculated. I think that that's one of the things that I'm learning in my life is not to necessarily be risk averse, but to be smart about the risks that we're taking. And I think that when you do your research, when you do your work and you lead with your values, then you'll probably end up on top. Now, of course, I could have come to Chicago and hated it and disliked it and, missed Boston. But I also feel like I set myself up in a way that if I needed to come back, I could be able to. And so the other thing I would say to people is in taking the risk, don't ever put all your eggs in one basket. And that's true whether we're taking professional risks. I think that's true if we're taking personal risks, like opening up to people, relationships, telling somebody something that's difficult for them to hear. I think that we take risks all the time. But I would say, people should be smart about the risks that they're taking. Sometimes I overcorrect. Sometimes I think I do that too much where I'm constant. I don't live in the moment enough because I'm always like, living 10 steps forward and thinking, what if this, what if that, what if this, what if that? So I don't want to be hypocritical in giving that information out because I'm not perfect at it. But I think that I would say take calculated risks.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think because with taking risks, you don't want to put yourself in a position that like if things don't go according to plan, you lose it all, right? Like
exactly.
So it's definitely smart to whatever it is in life to take risks, be calculated with it, be smart, but also have faith with it too. Going into Chicago, you had a lot of faith that this would be a situation that would work out, and that's kind of, I mean, the thing about faith is like, because sometimes when we have faith, it's like it's hard to live in the moment because like you're thinking like this is how I want it to go, and that's what you're looking at, but I do think that, like you said, like calculated risk is super smart. I definitely need that when it comes to just seeking out experiences and even trying to do things that align with our values, because there could be things that can kind of like you probably had opportunities that would have been kind of, I don't know if necessarily out of character, or maybe they just wouldn't be able to use you in the way that you feel like Mr. Texeira, I'd be able to like be my best at, basically. So
yeah, absolutely. I've been offered positions. I'll give you a really good example. So I've worked at 2 schools in Chicago. I'm going to my 3rd one. But the first school I worked at, it was crazy. But I don't say that like it was a crazy environment. It was a tough school. The teachers there were some of the hardest working people I've ever known. Like when you work in a really tough school, like, I mean, the teachers are really trying to keep their heads above water. The kids were great. Like it was not, I'm not like, crapping on the kids. It was a tough environment in terms of like the violence. And, it's a school that unfortunately had experienced declining enrollment with the increase of charter schools and things like that. And it was in a, tough spot and still is. And I was not happy about something that happened at my second school. Something I felt was very unfair to me. And to be honest, I was pissed. And I was ready to leave. And I was offered the opportunity at the previous school to go be a what was it? Essentially, it was like a coaching position. So the easiest way to think about it is, do you remember Miss Sebrian?
Yeah.
Do you remember when she left the classroom? I don't remember what year it was. There was a time where she was still working in the school, but she wasn't teaching. She was essentially.
Oh yeah, she was kind of like teaching, like coaching the teachers.
Yeah, so it would have been something like that.
Yeah,
and in some ways, it sounded really appealing to me. One of the hardest parts about teaching is grading, especially when you do like ELA or social studies, because so much of grading is writing. So I wouldn't have had to grade. I would have had my own office, which would have been nice. The school where I was just at, the teachers share rooms because the teachers don't have their own classrooms because the school's overcrowded. So I was like, I don't really like this. This is weird. So I had my own office. Even being in grad school, I would have been able to like leave work and then just drive immediately to school, which would have saved me a lot of time. And I was like, this could really significantly improve my quality of life. But then I just had to be honest with myself. And I didn't feel then that I could have been the best coach in that particular environment, which is funny to say now because I train teachers in project-based learning, but that's a very specific thing. It's like I'm training them on a very specific thing. That's much different than like, like the coach is going into the room telling the teacher like, hey, you need to do this, that. I was like, that's not my passion. It's not who I am to like go tell teachers like this is how you should be teaching. And it also changes the dynamic in the relationship. So the person who had been a coach before, she was a teacher, and the minute she became the coach, the relationships changed. People saw her as different, which I felt was unfair to her. And so, on one hand, it's like, yeah, I could have been the coach and it could have been good and all that. But I just had to be honest with myself. That wasn't where my passion is. I much prefer working with kids to working with adults. Like, of course, as a teacher, working in schools, you either mostly work with adults or you mostly work with kids. It's like one side or the other. You're an administrator or coach or like those kind of roles, or you're a teacher or a paraprofessional. And, working with kids like brings me joy. It brings me life in a way that working with adults just doesn't. Like, it's cool. I probably could have like done a good job at it, but I would not have been fulfilled. And so what I think is also important is to feel individually and personally fulfilled. Even like when I moved to Chicago. So I took a slight pay cut to come to Chicago. But it was okay because the cost of living here is cheaper, like rent and mortgage and that kind of thing. And at the point I'm at now, I closed the gap, if that makes sense. But I think it's really important to find what you're passionate about within reason. Like if I were passionate about a job where I didn't make anything, like that probably wouldn't be, reasonable for me. But, if somebody was like, well, Sam, you could make, I'm just going to make up numbers, like $100 an hour doing this thing that you really don't like much, or $70 an hour doing this thing that you love, then I would go to 70. I just think that it's important to feel passion in what you're doing. And sometimes I think that requires us to have a level of humility to say, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm going to opt out. So to your question earlier, have I ever been offered something and I had to turn it down because it just didn't align with my values? That's an example that stands out for me.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think because, what's portrayed out there is like money is the cure to happiness or whatever, and the money will make you driven to go after goals. But that's true. Like if you don't really have like a sense of like fire or like passion to do something, then you're not gonna be excellent at it. You'll kind of be mediocre.
And you know what? I say that, but money does matter. You have to be able to pay your bills.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
But, so one of the lines that I really like, and it's unfortunate to me how he has become, but I used to really love Kanye West, old Kanye, and his line, having money is not everything, not having it is. And what that means is that you can have all the money in the world and still be unhappy. So having money is not everything, but but if you're broke and if you're really struggling, that's what it's really is. So I think that there's a point at which like, you don't want to be like dirt poor and broke. And like you got to find something that pays the bills. But once your basics are covered and once, you have food on the table and a roof over your head and you're, like, then you should be passionate about like what it is that you really want to pursue. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. 100%. I think definitely. I mean, I'm not in a position where I'm paying my own like house bills, but or, like for my own house. But at the same time, it's like definitely once you get that stability, once you get stability, it's good to have in a way like a foundation to be able to then go after something you're passionate about rather than
and that changes over time. Like I remember when I first got my first teaching job, I was like, I'm going to take the first job that I can get. Like I didn't end up at Henderson because like, oh, this was a school I really wanted to be at. I interviewed at a bunch of schools. I didn't get hired because, as a new teacher, it's hard. They want experience. Yeah. Henderson was the first that offered me. I took it. It ended up being great. But now, like, I would never do that. Now, as much experience as I have teaching, okay, I'm going to feel things out. Is this really a space for me? And I think that comes with the territory. Just, you get older, you know yourself more, you know your value more, both your individual value and what you bring to the table, but also your core values. And are they in conjunction with things? Are they in conjunction with, or, are my core values in opposition to this environment? In other words, if I come into the school, there was once an interview I did, I was going to pause and not say it, but okay, you know what? I keeping it real. I am not the biggest fan of the last principal of the Henderson school and the most recent one. And I apologize if anybody is a fan or all that. She and I just didn't have a good experience early on in my career, before I was even a teacher. And I remember sitting in an interview with her when she was in Southie, and like instantly knowing like this is not the environment I want to be in. Like I can't be myself here. I can't like keep it. I probably would have taken the job anyway because it was before I was officially a teacher, and like I would have been miserable like to be in an environment like that where I couldn't actually be myself. And so, yeah, I do think that there is an element of as you figure out your value and as you figure out both your value and your core values, being intentional about the kind of spaces that you put yourself in and that you allow yourself to be placed in.
Yeah, that's good. Now, thanks for sharing that. And, this has been a very awesome, just like time to connect. And I'm sure all the people, Henderson alumni, people currently at the school are going to definitely look forward to this.
You know what's sad? There's nobody, well, except for teachers, there's no students at the school anymore that I taught.
Right.
So your brother's class, the class of 23 would have been like the last group I ever,
That's true. Yeah, it was like 20, right, because that was they were freshmen when I was a junior.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I was going to say, so for those listening right now that might want to connect with you and maybe get some tips and everything from you, how can people find you online and like your socials and everything?
Yeah, so Sam Texeira, which you can see at the bottom there, they can put that in Facebook, and I pop up. There's not that many of us. Spell it the right way because there's a couple different spellings of Texeira. They can also look me up at SAMMYTEXEIRA on both Instagram and Twitter. I know Twitter is called X right now, but I will never call it X. It's still Twitter.
Yeah, I don't call it X.
Yeah, it's still Twitter. So they can find me there. I feel like I have other social media that I barely use, but those are my big three: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Awesome. Thanks so much for everybody that listened, and Mr. T for your time.
Thank you. I'm so proud of you. It is really an honor. And I have to say, I mentioned this to my therapist earlier. It meant so much to me, like when you were on the phone with me earlier, you're like, oh, Dad, I'm talking to Mr. T. I love your family, your mom and your dad, your brother. It's just really been an honor to be able to be in you all's lives. And I thank you that, even like 4 years later, to still be able to connect with you all this way. So thank you. It's really
it's been a joy, truly. And it's been an honor to have you on the Find Your True Fire podcast.
All right. I can't wait to see it. Take care, everybody.
Yes, sir.